Beside me here is Lieutenant General retired United States Air Force Christopher Miller, retired out of the headquarters Air Force as the A5. Over to you, General. Thank you so much.
See, I think the real reason Dawn employed me in this position is because she knew I flew 440,000-pound airplanes with nuclear weapons. And in that world, you had to be able to hit a target within plus or minus 1 minute, a couple thousand miles away. And I'm very conscious this is the last panel of the day, so I'll make sure we're on time. I want to let my fellow presenters up here introduce themselves from the far end. Charlie Dunlap over, and then we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Charlie Dunlap. I'm a retired Air Force Major General. I was Deputy Judge Advocate General of the Air Force. I served about almost 34 years. And now I'm teaching at Duke Law School, and I run a center called the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security. I've been there for 13 years.
I'm Melissa Ken. I am an active duty JAG in the Air Force, and thus I have to read this disclaimer. So in accordance with 5 CFR section 3601.108, the views presented herein are my personal views and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or its components. I am an assistant professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I teach national security law as well as our core law class. And I just finished teaching law of war to my undergraduate students, so hopefully that'll help me make this more digestible for all of you. I've been in the Air Force for about a fifth of the time that General Dunlap served, and I am incredibly honored to be on this very well qualified panel and just excited to discuss this topic.
Just since we're doing the disclaimers, I'm speaking for myself, but also I'm not giving any legal advice. So if you need legal advice, you have to go to your counsel. We're going to be talking in generalities, I think.
Ditto.
Well, hey, thanks everyone. I'm Brendan Groves. I lead global policy, regulatory, and legal at Skydio. We're the largest U.S. domestic drone manufacturer. I grew up as an Air Force JAG, but thank God I no longer have to read disclaimers before my panel. So sorry about that, Melissa. But I went on to serve in the intelligence community and then ended my government career as Associate Deputy Attorney General for National Security, ran national security across the administration at the Justice Department and the FBI. And I'm really looking forward to digging into these questions that I actually teach at UT Austin and GW Law School.
Hi, I'm Jim Poss. I'm a retired Air Force Major General. When I retired, almost 10 years ago to the day, I was the Senior Career Intelligence Officer of the U.S. Air Force. And as such, I could tell you, I will give you intelligence advice for free, and you could take it home for the bank. So there we go. No, my big claim to fame was I was the first coalition chief of intelligence when we first got into Afghanistan. And so we were the guys that figured out how to do the first armed drone strikes and all of the law of armed conflict that entailed, and it entailed a very extensive legal defense by the good Major Dunlap, which he got me off on for free on numerous occasions. But retired in 2013. When I got out, I worked for Mississippi State University, and I founded Assure, which is the FAA's Drone Research Center of Excellence. And right now, I'm just kind of hanging out in my hometown on the Mississippi Gulf Coast near New Orleans and running a consulting business.
Like Don said, I'm Chris Miller. Spent about 33 years in the Air Force, about half of it flying airplanes, half of it in political military staff jobs and other things. Relevant to this discussion, I spent about a year in Afghanistan as the commander of the Commander Judge Advocate General pairing. At that time, we were kind of in the transition between mostly predators to mostly reapers. And it's been interesting to see it from that perspective. And I can tell you, you have some folks up here who have looked at that from a variety of perspectives. The reason that this panel, I think, should hold our interest is that if you've read a newspaper in the last 20 years or watched TV, you know that uncrewed, unmanned aerial systems have played a major role in combat, Iraq, Afghanistan, other places in the world. And most of them have been pretty large aerial vehicles operated by militaries procured through the defense processes. But when the Ukraine invasion began last year, what we saw was a pretty dramatic and public change in UAS employment. They've appeared on battlefields before, but this conflict is very different. Just today, literally just today, a significant strike was reported by Ukrainian drones on targets in Crimea. 2 hours ago, An MSN article reported Putin strikes back, Ukraine hit with drone strikes and bomber attacks. So this stuff is happening, and it's happening at an amazing pace, and it's complex. Ukraine's continued to express some pretty urgent needs for capability to strike targets and do other things with drones. The Russians have responded with their own both organic and externally procured things. Companies have worked directly with NATO, with Ukrainian defense officials, or even nonprofits to put COTS drones into the fight in military and volunteer force hands. So it's a delicate time in history. The violence of this conflict, the numbers of small UAS that are involved, largely commercial and global supply chains that bring them to the battlefield, the weapons that are being directed or deployed by the small UAS, and many units and operators selecting targets and employing them, not the big machine that the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. forces have used for years. Those things are all different, and I think Ukraine's emerging as a pretty powerful example of how compliance with established laws of armed conflict can either be observed or strengthened or violated in these kinds of new small UAS fought conflicts. It's also a laboratory in which existing norms will either be seen to suffice or new norms will emerge. And finally, one other point that I hope we get a chance to talk about a little bit is the ubiquity and utility of these systems, how transportable they are, how easily obtained they are for all kinds of surveillance and direct action poses some real questions for Homeland Security right here in the United States. So with that, I want to start by letting our law professor and my colleague working at the Air Force Academy talk about the fundamentals of laws of armed conflict and how military professionals have seen those laws for a while. Listen.
Thank you, sir. So yeah, as I mentioned, just finished teaching this to my college students. So I was told to assume that there is no legal knowledge foundation here. So hopefully I'm all warmed up on that. So what we're talking about today is international law, and there are lots of different types of international law. We have international criminal law, international securities law, economics law, pretty much anything you can think of. There's a body of international law that talks about how nations work together to accomplish those purposes. So what we're talking about today is international humanitarian law, IHL. And sometimes this is confused with human rights law. Human rights law, and just to clarify, human rights law is what applies during peacetime. There are those who argue that human rights law also applies during conflict, but generally speaking, we all agree it applies during peacetime and it imposes a higher threshold for when we can use lethal force. Lethal force has to be absolutely necessary to preserve life or accomplish other tasks, right? Whereas in IHL, what we're talking about when we're in conflict, this is where we can talk about who is a combatant, right? Who is legally targetable, and how do we target and attack lawful military objectives, right? And so when we're doing that, we consider 5 primary targeting principles. The first one is distinction, which is that really important ability to distinguish between lawful military objectives, like I said, uniformed military personnel. There's also this concept known as direct participation in hostilities, where civilians can lose their protected status if they are engaging in direct harm, whether that's physical harm or whether that's harm to military operations or military capacity. That can make civilians targetable under the law of war. Okay, so we have this principle of distinction where we need to figure out, is somebody actually lawfully targetable? We also have, and excuse me, I wanted to make sure that I got this out there, the International Committee for the Red Cross's definition of direct participation in hostilities. Like I said, we have to have that threshold of harm where we're causing physical harm or again, the harm to capacity or operations. There has to be direct causation, that causal link, as well as a belligerent nexus, meaning you are intending to cause harm to an enemy military force. Okay, so after we figured out if we can lawfully target an entity or an object, we then need to ask, is there a military necessity for carrying out that strike? Okay, we look at the object or individual's nature, location, use, purpose, as well as whether we have a definite military advantage that we're going to gain by executing that strike. And after that, we need to consider proportionality. Proportionality is where I think we spend a lot of our time. in addition to that DPH question, which can get very complicated. But proportionality says that damage to civilian populations or objects cannot be excessive in relation to a concrete and direct military advantage. Right? And my students often want to say, well, what does excessive mean? Is it, like a one lawful military objective to 5 civilians? No, there's no mathematical equation, right? It depends on the value of the military target. It depends on what exactly is the second and third order effects of targeting those civilians, right? So it's a very, very fact-specific analysis that we're engaging in with proportionality. Okay? And one of the things that I know is going to be a topic of discussion later is this concept called precautions, which is where if we're trying to take out an enemy command and control node, and that node happens to be located in an elementary school, okay? That's still active. There are elementary school age children coming and going from this school all day long. One way that we can mitigate damage to civilians is to do what? Attack the school at night or on the weekends when there are no children present. Right? So this concept of precautions is built into our proportionality principle to make sure that we are mitigating damage to the civilian population whenever we can. Because laws of war exist, one of the primary purposes is to protect civilians. And so that is a very, like I said, fact-sensitive and difficult analysis to conduct is that proportionality question. We also have the question of, or the principle of prevention of unnecessary suffering, which requires us to ensure that we are using weapons, not using weapons that will cause permanent disfigurement and blindness and things like that. So we have treaties that prohibit the use of chemical weapons, that prohibit the use of biological weapons. And that is because while war is necessarily lethal and will cause suffering, we want to try to limit that suffering again so we can protect civilians so that we can prevent conflict from escalating, keep it local, keep it contained as much as we can. Okay? And then the last thing that we need to consider is this prohibition against perfidious acts, right? And so perfidy is essentially taking advantage of your opponent's willingness to adhere to the laws of war, right? So think about an entity using a Red Cross van to transport troops, right? That's taking advantage of the protected status of the Red Cross symbol in order to help you gain advantage in a conflict, right? And that's illegal under international law because we don't want people to start attacking Red Cross vans, right? So we want to encourage adherence to laws of war on both sides. And so perfidy, taking advantage of your enemy's willingness to adhere to those acts, is a violation of international law. And so I've mentioned that a few times, violation of international law. But what happens if you violate international law? What's the accountability and the enforceability? And that can be a tricky question in and of itself, right? We have the International Criminal Court, which is an arm of the UN. It's the first permanent court that is able to hear criminal cases regarding war crimes and crimes against humanity. We've also seen these kind of ad hoc courts that stand up just to address specific points in history. So think Nuremberg trials, think the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, those kinds of things. Those were just temporarily stood up to address war crimes and crimes against humanity in those circumstances. And then we also see nations internally holding their own people accountable for war crimes. So in the United States, it's our policy that we are going to try our own people for those types of offenses. So think the Abu Ghraib incident, as well as Eddie Gallagher, those kinds of things. So internal accountability. So that's kind of the ground rules that we're playing by when we're having this conversation on the panel. And I'll open it up to comments or additions from my colleagues or further questions.
Well, that was really terrific, Melissa. The only thing I would add at this moment anyway, is that when you're doing the proportionality analysis and you're trying to figure out, what the gain is, it's what's anticipated. In other words, it's the whole lawfulness, for example, the drone strike is not necessarily determined by what happens afterwards. For example, things can go wrong. And simply because there's a lot of civilian casualties, it doesn't mean that somebody broke the law or something was done wrong. It could mean that the anticipated military gain, if you were going to kill like Osama bin Laden in a drone strike, that would be worth a lot. And so you'd be able to tolerate, as regrettable and as tragic as it is, a lot more drone strike, a lot more civilian casualties or damage to civilian property than maybe would be the case otherwise. But that's just it.
Yeah, and just to piggyback, that's an excellent clarification. And also, when we're evaluating these strikes, we're using the knowledge that the leaders had at the time that they made that decision. We don't retroactively attribute knowledge that we later gained to the decision they made at the time. So it's the anticipated military gain using the knowledge that those leaders had at the time the decision was made.
So I think this is probably a good time to turn to the intelligence officer, who's been in the middle of processing, exploitation, dissemination of the information that the drones produce. You've seen it, Jim. You've been there next to commanders, advising them and working with lawyers. So if you could give us a sense of what that looks like and how it's been.
Well, it's kind of interesting to be talking about this on the day before May Day in 2023, with a massive war going on in Ukraine, a lot of which is being done through both military drones and a tremendous amount being done through commercial drones. Tomorrow is going to be May Day. Stay glued to CNN. Gosh knows what's going to happen on both sides in there. I'm listening to all this, and I've heard it about them, a bunch of times from JAGs and stuff. But my caution to the audience is, a lot of this stuff only really works on Americans and some of our close allies. And what I mean by that is, we're, one of a handful of nations out there that would go to these lengths to prevent civilian casualties. And I'm here to tell you that. Nowadays, we've got about 65, depending on how you count it, continuous combat air patrols, CAPs, of a 24/7 MQ-9 up around the world constantly. And when we want to go after a target, we can dedicate 24-hour-a-day surveillance against that target if we want to. Develop a pattern of life. We can figure out exactly, where they live, where they work, what time of day do they get up. And we spend hours and hours and hours, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of airmen and intelligence communities folks go into finding when that guy is going to leave for work and when he is going to go down a road that is relatively abandoned, and then we're going to hit him then. We're one of a handful of nations that would go through to do that. Do you think the Russians are doing that? Do you even think the Ukrainians are doing that? I mean, do we really think the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is going to go through any of these things? The great thing about drones and the revolutionary impact about drones is that they've given us the ability to have 24/7 surveillance, if we wanted to have it. Now, I would argue, and I think my friends on the panel would argue, that drones are just another weapon of war. If I'm going to kill you with a Hellfire from an MQ-9, that's just the same as killing you with a Hellfire from an Apache, or sending the Marines in there to bayonet you, or CIA to stick a ballpoint pen in your eye socket or whatever. Those are all different weapons out there. But the difference with drones and the difference with modern drones is the sheer amount of intelligence that can get, and how that increases the perception, and I'm going to use a British term because we let the Brits into this and instantly increased our vocabulary by 1,000,000%. That increases the perception of omniscience, that we know everything, that we can see everything, and therefore anytime that we make a bad bomb, a drop, or we kill civilians, that's what we knew about that. And we did that on purpose, and that's bad. The movie I always tell people to look at to get an idea what drone warfare is really like is Eye in the Sky, thank you. Eye in the Sky, with one of my favorite actresses, Helen Mirren. And if you haven't seen the movie, Helen Mirren unfortunately plays an Army officer. She should have played a Royal Air Force officer. But she's an intelligence officer that's running an intelligence cell back in the UK. She has an American MQ-9 crew that is up over it was Al-Shabaab group in Nairobi, Kenya. She's got Kenyan special forces standing by. She's got Kenyan human intelligence agents on the side. All of her processing is being done by yet another American unit in Hawaii. And the whole thing is about, they found that Al-Shabaab has got arming suicide bombers inside this building. And the one inaccurate thing about that is the fact that they've got little bird drones that can see exactly what's going on in there. But if you can imagine having to make a strike when you don't know what's going inside that building, but you do know what's going on outside. And in this case, they had a little girl that was selling bread and all this kind of good stuff. And the agony that dozens of lawyers and politicians go into before they allow those folks to make that strike is a very realistic show of what we're doing nowadays. But I'm here to tell you, war is still war. And you guys might disagree with me, but there are many, many times where it's unfortunate, but you have to take civilian casualties in order to achieve an objective. Very first night of the war in Afghanistan, it was the very first time that we'd been revealed that we'd had an armed drone. We had that armed drone up over Mullah Omar's house, who was the leader of the Taliban. We were only up there for a couple hours. We knew he was in the house, which was a stupid thing to do. He thought that there was going to be a ground attack by the special forces guys, didn't think about armed drones. Had 2 Navy fighters overhead, and we're about to strike that guy. But the problem we had was everybody thought we knew everything about everything, but all we really knew was where that house was and what had been happening for an hour or so. And one person, I'm not going to name her name, but Charlie knows her, came up the objection that we couldn't make that strike because we didn't know who was inside the house, and that there were probably family members because it's a big house and all this, and we could have killed dozens of civilians. And we didn't make that strike. And Mullah Omar died of what we think was old age about 8 years later. And we could have made a decapitation strike in there. But those are the kind of decisions that you get when you're dealing with this kind of weapon system that gives you the impression that you know everything, but you will never, ever, ever know everything in war. And you're never going to be able to factor out all of the things, and terrible things are going to happen in war.
Yeah. So General Dunlap, I remember when Kosovo was ongoing, a lot of criticism of the Air Force because we were dropping bombs from 15,000 feet, and the contention was we weren't close enough to distinguish between friend and foe, legitimate and illegitimate targets. My rejoinder was always, well, a 155 howitzer goes a very long way, and the folks on the ground who launch that don't see it where it's going exactly either. But there's an argument to be made that drones have fundamentally changed things because of what they can see and what they can do. Can you kind of talk us through what's different and what's the same?
A couple things about drones. When they first came out, a lot of people were wringing their hands about this idea of killing from afar. That there's something immoral about killing from afar. Actually, does anybody know when I think the oldest recorded missile strike was David versus Goliath? Because militaries, since literally the dawn of man, have been trying to figure out how they can engage with their weapons in a way that the adversary cannot engage with his. And, Philip of Macedonia developed the 16-foot spear for his phalanx. Everybody else had a 12-foot spear. Guess how that worked out on the battlefield? The adversaries had 4 feet of spear through them before they were able to engage. So it's not new. I think the idea of having so much information is different. And I think when we look at what's going on in Ukraine and other places, drones are really most valuable, I think, for the ISR piece of it. Because especially the commercial drones that the Ukrainians are using, they are strapping some things to them, but I think most of it, and Jim, I'd like to hear your views or anybody else on the panel, they're using it to cue artillery or other weapons. In other words, they see where the adversary is, and then they cue an artillery barrage or something like that. And that's pretty clearly how the Russians are using drones, and there's thousands of these drones being used. So in other words, I think it's important that we think of these weapons as what Melissa said. They are other weapons. They are weapons. And they are not, a lot of people are talking about war being fundamentally changed. The nature of war doesn't change. The character of war may change. And so we are now in an environment, not just because of drones, but because of other technologies, where information is just almost too much for the people who have to make the decisions on it. And I would just make one other observation about, people think, a lot of people anyway, think that the only way, and Jim, your story reminded me of this, the only way you protect civilians is to somehow have more restrictive rules of engagement, require more information, watch the target for a longer time. I would suggest to you that that's not necessarily the case. I call it the, let's see, what do I call it? The risk, you're transferring risk to the people on the ground, because the fact of the matter is, if a drone strike doesn't take place, that means that individual can live and do horrible things, maybe for years, and kill a lot more people than would have been killed had he been taken out in a particular drone strike. I call it the moral hazard of inaction in war. So it's not, you don't protect people necessarily by not using force with this idea that you have to be overprotective of civilians. I'm not suggesting at all anything but extremely strict adherence to the law of war. But, and I'd like to hear what the rest of the audience, or rest of my panelists think. I personally have never been involved in an operation where the rules of engagement were not more restrictive than what the law of war would permit, and typically significantly more restrictive than what the law of war would predict.
That's a different thing.
Could you tell us a little bit what's going on?
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to shed a light on the tactics that are in use on the ground, which raises the question of the unique use of commercial off-the-shelf systems. But we shouldn't, in fact, begin by talking about Ukraine. We should begin by talking about Syria. So about 7 or 8 years ago, we in the US government, and the intelligence community specifically, started to see really interesting novel uses of commercial off-the-shelf drones, almost exclusively those made by DJI, the largest drone company that's based in China. There was at first a sophisticated use of drones for ISR, as General Dunlap mentioned. So small, sleek, low-flying drones that were very difficult to detect with conventional surface systems, including radars that were designed to detect MiG-29s, not a small 5-pound drone flying 50 feet above the earth. And phase 2 of this experimentation on the part primarily of ISIS and Al-Qaeda was the weaponization of these small drones, initially with 40-millimeter grenades, primarily Russian-made. And they were at first really bad at actually striking targets with grenades, but they improved and they actually developed, and I'll keep this at a high level, but they got much more sophisticated as they came, and they had classes where they taught folks how to do this. It was quite an operation. This wasn't just a couple of friends who were members of ISIS that thought it would be fun to drop grenades with drones. This was a professional military endeavor, and I maybe won't go into any more details there. They got really good at it. So the US government, beginning in 2017, said, how would we respond to this in the event that ISIS or Al-Qaeda tried to do the same thing in the homeland? And that's when some of us got tapped and said, hey, how would we do that? Figure it out, and if we need a law, pass it. So I had the good fortune or the misfortune to lead that effort. So 18 months later, we passed a law called the Preventing Emerging Threats Act through the Congress that allows the federal government to detect and disrupt the malicious use of drones in the United States. That required a bunch of legal changes to Title 18 that we won't go into unless you're really, really bored today, but it was difficult to pull off because of that. So now we have that authority as a government. Fast forward to last year. In the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion, you started to see on the screens across CNN the use of thousands of small commercial off-the-shelf drones by both sides. So this tactic really pioneered by terrorist organizations, non-state actors, had been professionalized by two large militaries, one of them arguably a great power and near peer. And both of them were using it both for ISR and weaponization, and they were primarily relying on the same type of drones made largely by DJI at the first start of war almost exclusively. And so now I like to say that war in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side is war by WhatsApp and drone. If you are on the front line, that is all you have, right? We in the US, when I was in Afghanistan with Joint Special Operations, we had a hope and a prayer that there was some kind of ISR assets that could see around the corner if we needed it. No such luck for those on the front lines in Ukraine. Whatever your pristine, expensive system is, it's going to get jammed or shot down. So in a great power conflict, your ISR capability is what you carry, period, point blank. That is not how we train. It's not how we fight. But it's how Ukraine must train and must fight. So this is a fundamentally different way to fight a war. By the way, it's the same characteristics of warfare we'd likely see in the Indo-Pacific. God forbid we find ourselves in a fight in that theater of war. So with that having whet your appetite, I hope, I'll pause.
Jim, any additional thoughts on this
No,
topic?
that's a great stuff, Brandon. I mean, kind of going with what General Dunalp said, I mean, really when you boil down to it, the best way to protect civilians is to win. Don't lengthen the war. Don't fail to make that decapitation strike, which we did first night of the war. And look into perspective of what drone warfare has done. When was the last time an airliner flew into an American building or one of our close air allies? Yeah, 9/11. The drones wiped the floor with Al-Qaeda. When I left the air staff in 2013, drones had played a big part in finding Osama bin Laden. If you've ever seen Zero Dark 30, that's pretty accurate the way they did it. We had wounded his second in charge, who's kind of an idiot and who is in charge of Al-Qaeda now. We had killed the operational guy, the third highest ranker in Al-Qaeda, with drones 9 times. World's worst job, never be the operational chief in Al-Qaeda. ISIL, did land a few blows on us with commercial drones, but drones played a huge role, along with very brave Iraqi special forces and a heck of a lot of air power in wiping out ISIL and all that. It really has become the answer that works, against counterterror. Reasonable men and women can differ over how that would work out in a major combatant. I think we found in Ukraine and Russia what happens if neither side invests in its air force or precision weapons or anything like that. Or certainly not stealth weapons. They get lost pretty quickly. So.
Okay, I want to change gears just a little bit, and we can talk more about Ukraine as we go. But if you look at the evolution of drones, however conceived, they really started off pretty well human in the loop, absolutely in control in the form of cruise missiles that went where you sent them, then cruise missiles that went where you sent them, but had a little bit of discretion in where they decided the actual target was. I want to kick over a little bit of a hornet's nest now and talk about how does the law of armed conflict and what we've discussed so far apply to future autonomous drones and swarming drones that both are eminently technically feasible these days and could be fielded in large numbers. So whoever wants to take that one on.
I'm happy to set the
Don't
stage.
everybody
maybe,
jump in.
Just from a technological perspective, I think there are 3 technological trends that are changing, as General Dunlap put it, the character of war. The first is autonomous robotic devices, both in the air, on the ground, under the surface, under the sea. And you see this has moved quickly from fiction to fact. Skydio is an AI company. We make robots that happen to fly. They turn out to be profoundly useful for defense, just like they are for Ukraine. We have hundreds of systems across the front lines in Ukraine, most of which are actually, we started doing that within literally 3 or 4 days of the outbreak of war last year. And now we're heavily leveraged supporting the men and women that make up the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And we make small, smart systems that are resistant to Russian electronic warfare, although not immune, because we use computer vision to operate. And that turns out to be enormously helpful if your adversary is trying to jam your drone or jam, for instance, GPS, as the Russians really like to do. There was a story yesterday that they've jammed GPS all around Moscow. Not good if you're using Google Maps, by the way, to navigate. The second trend is remote operations, right? This was popularized really by folks like General Poss and that community almost 30 years ago now, but it's migrated to smaller, smarter, lower flying, lower consequence systems that can be totally flown remotely, so not a person on site. But the third theme and the third trend line is what General Miller mentioned, and that's this idea of mass, right? Ukraine shows us that mass actually does matter in great power conflict. And one way to get mass without a risk to humans is having attritable, smart robotic systems, whatever those may be. Drones are really the first tip of the spear, right? The piece of the iceberg we see now. But in the future fight, you will see small, smart, attritable systems at enormous scale. You see that a little bit in Ukraine and Russia on both sides of the equation, but it's really just a dim hint of things to come.
I would just put a footnote on that to something that General Miller said. The U.S. policy right now on artificial intelligence and its incorporation into weapon system is there has to be meaningful human control. And exactly what that means now and in the future will be a big issue. We don't quite know what our adversaries are, whether our adversaries are looking to have meaningful human control. Because as we can see, artificial intelligence allows decision-making at hyperspeed. And so I think that is something that we're going to be looking at in the future and trying to deal with. And generative AI, that's a whole nother ballgame. I don't even like saying this, but I think that we will see that on the battlefield. Our adversaries are certainly, in my judgment, based on what I see in the newspapers, are certainly working on it. And so we're going to see that. And so we have to figure out, how do we weaponize this in a way that complies with the law of war? I believe it can be done. It's not easy to do. We don't have all the answers, but everything we've talked about the use of drones that we've used in the war have been in compliance with the law of war. You can make these systems work, but it won't be easy because I think initially, and Brendan, I really want to hear, you're much smarter on this than I think we are going to see drones, but swarms, but I think that they're going to have, it's going to be circumscribed pretty precisely what they can do. They're not going to be out there right yet thinking on their own. They will have a specific kind of task that they'll want to do. I do think, a couple years ago, I wrote this article about drones in the future that will hunt individuals. In other words, marrying a drone with facial recognition. And so it can go on the battlefield. And these could be fairly small drones that look for a specific person to kill. And that might be the commander, it might be some technical expert. And it will have a lot of effects, I think, on the military, because one of the things about the military is that you have this shared risk. And that will disrupt that, because some people on the battlefield will be at more risk than others. And we don't yet know how that will affect the morale and discipline of the troops.
I think if I can just interject real quick, just to ground this back in those targeting principles that we were talking about. One of the main issues with autonomous drones, taking the human out of the loop, is that first question of distinction can become problematic, because there's going to be an error rate. that the drone may not always, 100% of the time, identify the correct person that it's been given as a target. Now, no person has a 100% accuracy rate when we're talking about distinction either, but for some reason, we're more comfortable with a human making that mistake as opposed to an autonomous drone and AI system making that mistake. So you have interesting questions when it comes to that principle of distinction when you're looking at an individual targeting decision. You could reframe that to look at it from a proportionality issue. What if it has a 25% error rate? Is that acceptable under proportionality? Is that excessive civilian damage in relation to the military objective that we're gaining? So just to ground that in those targeting principles that we were talking about earlier, there are a couple different issues with using autonomous drones and taking people out of the loop.
Just a couple quick points. One is, this is a decision point for companies. And every company that's participating as a vendor has a decision point to make with respect to weaponization. Skydio has decided not to weaponize our products, in part because we think that fully autonomous lethal weapons are probably a bad idea, or at least inadvisable in the short term. So we've made that decision, put a stake in the ground, but our products are enormously useful for ISR, and we fully support that. The second thing I would say, to General Dunlap's point, is the first instantiation of multi-agent swarms will be for what the RAND Corporation refers to as the sensing grid. This is a highly automated network of sensors in the air, on the surface, subsurface, that all connect to assist in the targeting process. They can identify assets in space, push that real time to a command center, and that allows the commander to make enormously precise, rapid, agile decisions with respect to targeting and maneuver. So I do think that's what we'll see. However, let's say that you're trying to repel an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, let's say, and you have 2,000 amphibious landing craft in the strait. Now, in that case, having perhaps a much larger robotic system, whether it's in the air or underwater or whatever, that is only programmed to do one thing, and that's to attack a large L-class, maybe PLA landing vessel. That's a totally different question, right? That's not what General Poss had to face in far regions of Afghanistan where these questions are tricky, right? An L-class landing ship heading towards Taiwan is probably a little bit simpler analysis under the law of war, as we all know. So I think that's the thing you'll see in the future, but directed at the great power conflict environment where the laws of war apply in maybe a more straightforward manner than they have in the conflicts of the last 25 years.
So we've got about 3 minutes left, because I want to give you all about 5 minutes worth for questions. So if you could, just some quick closing comments and take on the easy topic of what happens if an adversary decides to use any of these kinds of capabilities in our homeland legally.
Yeah, well, I mean, my catchphrase is, we worry about a lot of different threats in the Air Force, bombers coming in, hypersonic missiles, ICBMs. I think the next attack on the United States is not going to come from across a hemisphere. It's going to come from across the parking lot. And what the Ukrainians are doing to Russia and may do in a big way tomorrow during May Day is exactly the threat that we ought to watch about. I drove to go see my son in Temple, Texas a couple weeks ago. And if you ever drove down I-10, once you hit the Texas border until you get to Houston, is one massive oil refinery. I probably wouldn't need a drone. I could probably take out a lot of stuff with a rock. Any one of they're called cracking towers, and they're very precise pieces of machinery that boil off oil at a very specific thing. That's what we always hit when we hit an oil refinery. Very vulnerable to commercial, to a small drone hitting that, because for God's sake, they're petroleum. They'll blow up. It takes about 2 years to replace a cracking tower. And I've seen an awful lot of stuff about counter UAS authorities and all that kind of good stuff. I ain't seen a lot of action. No one can answer the question, who's protecting those refineries out there, because there really isn't anybody doing it. So it's something that you should worry about. It's something that you should lose sleep about. we Americans always obsess about, our Pearl Harbor and all that kind of good stuff. This isn't really a Pearl Harbor. What we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine is the Spanish Civil War that happened before World War II, where there were blindingly obvious lessons that we should have applied, but we just flat out didn't do it. And there are blindingly obvious lessons occurring daily in Ukraine and Russia that we are not acting fast enough on.
So as it happens, the law that allows the federal government to detect and disrupt malicious drones in the US is at some level of risk. The administration is trying to reauthorize it, in fact, expand it to critical infrastructure owners and operators, and they failed to do that last year. Pretty much the entire commercial drone industry supports the administration in that. This is not a partisan issue. This is wide bipartisan support, but there are some in Congress that have some questions and concerns. So I think, practically speaking, if you care about that, talk to your members of Congress, because it's quite sensible to extend this in a privacy protective way, and I hope that happens.
Yeah, so I just want to echo what General Dunlap was talking about earlier in the panel, that the law of war is still the law of war. In the face of all of these developing and emerging technologies, whether it's drones, whether it's cyber capabilities, and we have the Talon manual, if you want to Google it, which is how we fit cyber capabilities into our current understanding of the law of war. Those laws are still very much in existence. They're still very much at play. And that is still how we are governing our conduct in the international realm.
Just to footstop a little bit what Melissa said, we adhere to the law of war, not because it's just some thing that we do. We adhere to it because our warfighters need to know that what they're doing is legal and moral. That's much more important than I think sometimes people on the outside of the military really appreciate. We do it because the American people demand it of us. Adversaries love to show what they would claim to be a violation of the law of war, because they're waging what we sometimes call lawfare to show that, oh, they're doing something illegal or immoral, so that they can undermine the public support that democracies need. But I will tell you that I think that in the U.S. military anyway, the law of war is really important, and it really impacts things. We need to make sure, though, that we don't put policies on top of the law of war that restrict the commander's discretion to do the things that she will need to do in a major war, particularly. And we won't have a lot of time to think about it. We need to focus on the fundamentals, and we can adhere to that, and we can prevail. But, people used to always ask me, oh, the other guy's not following the law of war. Why should we? Because we're Americans. Or we're from democratic countries and we believe in this. That's what we're fighting for. That's what it's all about. So it's not just some technical thing that we want to do because there's some law out there. There's a very strong, not just moral, but practical military necessity for doing it, I would suggest.
Exactly. Okay, with that, do we have any questions? Let's go back to front. Yes, sir.
Tactics. We have aircraft on aircraft gray zone tactics. And I'm interested in the panel's opinion on aircraft swarms on vessels as gray zone tactics, because that's the reality that I'm facing right now, and we're perhaps not optimally prepared for that.
Anyone?
Actually, the funnest part of my career was flying reconnaissance during the Cold War. And, during the Cold War, I'm not sure what the difference is between a Cold War and a gray zone war, but the rules, particularly when you're out over international airspace and you're out over, out over the sea, outside of territorial seas, the rules are you can get away with what you can get away with. And there's all kinds of stuff, going on out there that takes it just right to the limit to where the U.S. is not going to respond militarily or economically or anything like that, and all we're going to do is lodge a diplomatic complaint. The Russian Su-27 fencer that dropping the fuel on the U.S. MQ-9 a couple weeks ago, that is a standard Russian tactic. They've been doing that for years. He messed it up, because he's Russian. It happens all the time. Chinese are even worse. The Chinese make the most ridiculous, statements out there of how much the South China Sea they claim and how they do that, and they follow it aggressively and all that. But long answer short is, in gray zone, you get away with what you can get away with.
See, I think we need.
I would just say real quickly, just so everybody, gray zone, that's a phraseology in the military world where they try to keep it right below the level of a use of force. Why is that important? Because Article 2 of the UN Charter prohibits the use of force, and Article 51 says that any country can defend themselves if they're subject to an armed attack. As it happens, the U.S. interpretation of that is, the U.S. view is we reserve the right to act in self-defense on any use of force. Other countries think there's a delta between the use of force in Article 2 and armed attack in Article 51. And so this is the dilemma that we're in. And what we need to do is carefully craft, this is when rules of engagement would be really good, really helpful. Craft the rules of engagement so that the political leaders know exactly what's going to take place when that happens to our forces. And the execution, of course, will be to the commanders in the field. But
I knew this was going to be really hard to keep on time. I'm gonna volunteer my fellow panelists to stay up here for a few minutes for anyone who's got a question. I want to say thanks to you for some great insights, and thanks to Don for pulling this together. Obviously, a pretty rich topic.